And that ended up having a hugely detrimental effect, I think, on the policy process, but very effective as a news hook. The other thing that happened that year was Congress and then Colin Powell said that the situation in Darfur was genocide. Against the backdrop that you already had of Rwanda with the way that Darfur entered the news cycle, this was again of huge significance. Finally, the first executive branch of any government in the world saying that a conflict was genocide whilst it was ongoing. And yet inside the US government, there was nothing like any sense of a unified commitment to do something about this. If you talk to Powell, you find out that he made his genocide determination on Thursday, September the 9th. He had gone to see President Bush on the Tuesday, just 2 days before. Mr. President, on Thursday, I'll be calling the situation in Darfur genocide. To which President Bush says to Condoleezza Rice, Condi, you better let the heads of the other agencies know so they're not surprised. In no way was this a unified commitment to do something. And so you then ask Powell, well, what were you thinking? What did you imagine would come from labeling the situation genocide? And he says, I was hoping that if I called it genocide, I would get other countries on the UN Security Council to act. Major miscalculation. The man who had stood before the UN Security Council just 18 months earlier to say that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq was not the credible voice to be leading the world on this. And there's two lessons, I think, from what followed. That really set the stage sort of geopolitically. You had the US out in front, you had the Europeans very skeptical of the US, and then you had Bashir spinning this in the Arab media as evidence of US intent to invade a third Muslim country. Two lessons. Number one is that human rights is completely interconnected. You can't be torturing people in Abu Ghraib one day and then calling out the Sudanese regime on its human rights atrocities the next. You just don't have any credibility. And so for you guys, what this means is that you have friends who are working on other issues, who are working to close Guantanamo, who are working to get accountability for the torture cases. You need to be supporting them, working with them, and thanking them when they get it right, because the more success that they have, the better that you will be able to do. Lesson number two is that we have to update for context. Powell didn't do it, and part of the problem, I think, certainly in the early stages of the Darfur advocacy movement, is that advocates didn't do it either. The world was changing, the US position was changing, and we weren't updating. What his genocide determination did do, though, completely, I think to his surprise, to the surprise of the Bush administration and everybody, was to really catalyze this incredible citizens movement. And I want to focus on a few of the things that really were game changers that the movement did, and did very well. Number one was to introduce accountability into Congress for how they were responding to genocide and mass atrocity for the first time in history. Doing things that really domestic lobby organizations had worked out how to do ages ago. Issuing scorecards that then citizens picked up, they petitioned with, they phoned their representatives with, and all of a sudden you had not just staffers but senators themselves calling the offices saying, I'm being screamed at by the high schoolers in my district because I got a C+ on my report card. Just tell me how I can get a better grade. So this instantaneous reaction. And what that did is it blew out of the water an alibi that had been there for a long time for policymakers. For a long time, when you look back on the history, they've said, we didn't do anything because we didn't think that the American public cared. And this movement changed that. No longer can they use this alibi. And one of the amazing things about Fighting for Darfur is you cannot find any policymaker in that story saying, oh, I didn't think that the public cared. Victory number two was on the funding side. Advocates managed to get $2 billion worth of funding in humanitarian aid into Darfur between 2005 and 2008. That was second only to Iraq and Afghanistan, and tenfold more than any other crisis in Africa. And what we know is that it was having a mass movement as opposed to your traditional human rights model that achieved that. Because there were other issues that also had really serious humanitarian needs, and that also had advocates going to Congress and saying, we need this money for these humanitarian and human rights needs. But at that time, Darfur was the only one where the conversation in Congress was, yes, there are humanitarian needs, yes, there are human rights needs, but by the way, if you don't appropriate this money, we have voters in your district that are going to raise hell about it. That was why it was effective. Number 3 was the impact on the media. Through citizen advocates' efforts, we had a 3-fold increase in Darfur coverage from when it initially broke through in April 2004 to what it was 3 years later. That never happens on a crisis. Just think of Egypt. It was in our headlines, the only thing that you could see in February. Now you actually have to work hard to find an Egypt story. And this is the usual thing. News organizations send in their correspondence at the moment of crisis, but then they move on to the next crisis. They forget. It's a very short-term memory that we have in the media. And this leads into this sort of downward spiral, because journalists will continue to pitch stories on the quote-unquote old crisis. And their editors will say, that's not really newsworthy anymore. I'm not getting the sense that the public wants to read about this anymore. The public, of course, are not displaying any interest in it because they're not seeing it covered in the media anymore. So you end up in this downwards negative spiral. What activists did, what you all did, was to completely switch that around. Every time that there was an article on Darfur, activists wrote letters to the editor, got in contact with the news organizations saying, we're reading this and we want to see more of it. And what was amazing was that editors took their cue from the advocates. They kept assigning stories, they kept covering it. And that again meant that policymakers were unable to turn away. What, though, did all of this mean actually for Darfur? This is a question that I think at some point, at least some of us, started forgetting to ask. And it sounds heretical to say it, and I'm saying it not because I don't think that people continue to care about Darfur. Everybody involved in this, working as volunteers, giving up all of their time, cared and continues to care about Darfur very, very deeply.